Good evening, everyone. My name is Doug Kriner, and I'm a professor of government at Cornell and the faculty director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. I'd like to welcome you all to a very special edition of our ongoing series of teletown halls. This evening, we're beyond fortunate to have four distinguished members of the United States House of Representatives with us. The House Majority Whip, James Clyburn, Representative Emanuel Cleaver, Representative Barbara Lee, and Representative Terri Sewell. We're also very fortunate to have political strategist and analyst Basil Smikle to moderate this evening's discussion. Thank you all for taking the time when you all have so much to do to speak with us this evening. This is an extraordinary opportunity to hear our guests' thoughts and engage them in dialogue about how our country can learn from this moment of tragedy and begin to right centuries of wrong by effecting meaningful change, addressing inequality, and combating the scourge of systemic racism. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and hope that you will continue to join us both at IOPGA and in fora throughout the Cornell community to explore how we can join the national dialogue and individually and collectively become agents of much needed change. It's now my pleasure to introduce Representative Steve Israel, our Institute Director, to give us a brief overview of the Institute and its mission, and to formally introduce this evening's honored guests. Congressman Israel.
Well, Professor Kriner, thank you for the work you do as the faculty director of the Institute and for working so hard to build the Institute as well. I want to thank our very special guests. They are true national leaders. I had the extraordinary pleasure of serving with each of them. We're joined tonight, and I'm going to properly introduce them in a moment, but obviously we're joined tonight by the Majority Whip of the House of Representatives, James Clyburn, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's going to be on in just a few minutes, Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, and Congresswoman Terri Sewell. I cannot think of a more informed and articulate and passionate moderator for tonight's conversation than Basil Smikle. I do have some acknowledgments. So we have about 700 people who have registered for this evening's conversation. And I do want to acknowledge some past and present leaders in public policy. The former United States Secretary of Agriculture is with us tonight, Secretary Dan Glickman. The former U.S. ambassador to India and also a House colleague, Tim Romer. Former Senators Mark Kirk, a Republican from Illinois, and Larry Pressler, a Republican from South Dakota, are with us. Former House members Rush Holt from New Jersey, Brian Baird from Washington, Ben Chandler from Kentucky, Tom Coleman from Missouri, Betty Sutton from Ohio. The former chairman of the New York State Republican Committee, Ed Cox, is with us. Several members of the New York State Legislature, Assemblyman Chuck Levine, Assemblyman Steve Stern, Assemblywoman Taylor Darling, Tompkins County Legislator Henry Granison, former member of the New York State Public Service Commission, Tracy Edwards, and the former supervisor of the town of Hempstead, Laura Gillen. Also, three members of the Cornell Board of Trustees are with us, Christina James, Jeremy Cruiser, and Martin Scheinman. Martin is also a founding member of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. Very brief message about the Institute itself. Our mission is curating political programs designed to deepen discourse and raise understanding. We are bipartisan, and so our speakers have included the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and the former Chief of Staff for President Trump, Reince Priebus. Our virtual platforms have featured Senator Amy Klobuchar, Republican Senator Bill Cassidy, several major and prominent authors, ambassadors, and others. Tomorrow at noon, if you're interested, we'll be featuring Inside the Presidential Election with Charlie Cook, CNN's conservative pundit S.C. Cupp, and of course Basil Smikle, who you'll hear from in just a moment. June 25th, Congressman Adam Schiff, the chairman of the Permanent Committee on Intelligence. Terri Sewell is a member. He'll be briefing us on potential election intrusions by foreign powers. Tonight, as I said before, nearly 700 of you have registered for a discussion of race and justice in America. And before I introduce the guests, a very quick observation. I cannot think of a more critical issue than the one we discussed this evening. But for many of us, this is not a new issue. For some of us, this is something that we've kind of woke to. But for many of us, this issue has been persistent, systematic, and has been a stain on our country and our society for quite some time. When I served on Capitol Hill, I walked past the Supreme Court every day, and engraved in that building are the words "equal justice under the law." And many of us know today that there is no equal justice under the law. Justice is applied unevenly and in many cases unfairly. I do have a sense, and I hope that our speakers will comment on this tonight. For some reason, at least my experience is, it seems to be a different moment. You know, I represented a pretty affluent suburb, a moderate suburb of New York City. I see front lawns now with Black Lives Matter signs. I see mailboxes in Nassau County, Long Island, with Black Lives Matter signs. I drove through an intersection 2 days ago, and horns were honking and blaring. Usually that means in New York, get out of my way. But in this case, those horns were honking to encourage a group of high school protesters. So I hope that we are at a tipping point, and I hope that we can reflect on that this evening. A little bit of housekeeping tonight. Basil Smikle will moderate a conversation with our 4 members of Congress until 6 p.m. And then from 6 to 6:30, we'll have time for questions and answers. You'll be instructed on how to pose a question. Now, let me introduce our extraordinary roster of speakers. James Clyburn, as I said before, majority whip of the House of Representatives. That means that he is the 3rd highest ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives. He has represented his district in South Carolina since 1993. He's led Congress on health care, on education. He chairs the House Select Committee on the coronavirus crisis. And many of us know his endorsement of Joe Biden may have been slightly influential in helping to secure the nomination of Mr. Biden. Barbara Lee has represented Oakland, California since 1998. She is a leading voice on peace, justice, and poverty issues. She serves on the Budget Committee and the very powerful Appropriations Committee. We sat next to one another on that committee when we served together. She is the only African-American woman serving in the House leadership as co-chair of the Steering and Policy Committee. Representative Emanuel Cleaver, serving his 7th term, representing the district that was home to President Harry Truman in Missouri. A member of the House Financial Services Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, the Committee on the Modernization of Congress. He has passed sweeping legislation on housing reform, and he leads Congress in urging civility and respect in discourse. And of course, Representative Terri Sewell. She's represented Alabama's 7th district for 5 terms. She is the first Black woman elected to Congress from Alabama. She's the vice chair of the Exclusive House Ways and Means Committee, also serves on the House Intelligence Committee. She is a chief deputy whip to Mr. Clyburn and co-chair of the Congressional Voting Rights Task Force. And finally, our moderator, Basil Smikle. You see him regularly on MSNBC and CNN. He holds a PhD from Columbia. He's an alumnus of Cornell University. He was the executive director of the New York State Democratic Committee. He co-chairs the Leadership Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, and he was an instrumental and key advisor to Hillary Clinton when she served in the United States Senate. Thank you all for being patient with my introductions, and with that, let me turn it over to Basil Smikle.
Thank you so much, Steve. I am going to piggyback on a comment you made about how this is such a, it seems like such a different moment in time, and I reflected on that last weekend. I was up in Riverdale here in New York City. For those that are familiar with the area, it's actually a fairly affluent neighborhood in the Bronx, but they don't often consider themselves part of the Bronx. But I saw a host of Black Lives Matter signs and young people, very young, 10 years old, some younger, carrying Black Lives Matter signs, and it definitely made a difference, and it does seem like this is it's a different moment in time. And these protests, these Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, are entering their 4th week amid calls to defund the police. States and municipalities are really taking a hard look at police reform legislation, and some have acted pretty swiftly. We saw that in the city of Louisville, Kentucky, the city council passed Breonna's law in the wake of the killing of Breonna Taylor, and that law will ban no-knock warrants. We've also seen that the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, today signing a package of police reform and criminal justice legislation. San Francisco, over the last day or so, they have announced that their police department would no longer respond to non-criminal calls. That means calls affecting the mentally ill, the homeless, even school discipline. And that is extraordinary given the time that we're in and the importance of some of these decisions. But it clearly is difficult work, partly because there are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country, and we know that the work is never done. We saw the killing of Rashard Brooks in Atlanta, and the report has said that he was shot twice in the back, and the medical examiner has ruled that a homicide. And I remember my own experience in New York protesting the death of Amadou Diallo over 20 years ago. Member, resident of the Bronx, where I grew up, and an immigrant like my parents were. So this is an extraordinary moment in time because we're sort of faced with two pandemics here. The pandemic of the COVID virus, which has decimated communities of color, particularly African-American communities around the country, but we're also in the midst of another pandemic, the 400-year scourge of racism in this country, both of which have laid bare our disparities in health, wealth, and obviously criminal justice. So it was pretty extraordinary moment last week when the House introduced a package of reforms, and the four distinguished members of Congress who are on our panel today are the leaders who are going to be pushing some of these important national standards and national dialogue around race and justice in America. So I want to get right into it and start with the Majority Whip, Congressman Jim Clyburn. Sir, I'd be remiss to not mention that in 2 days, on June 17th, we will be at the 5-year anniversary of the shooting at Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. So reflecting on the ways in which Congress and political institutions have responded to crises and have responded to systemic racism, talk a bit about the Justice in Policing Act. And if you could, talk about what the other side is saying, especially as we've heard today that President Trump is announcing an executive order, details to be determined, an executive order on police reform.
First of all, thank you very much for having me, Basil, and thank you, Steve, for your friendship, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. And to my colleagues, thank you. And it's great to know that Cornell University is dependent upon the wisdom of the Paramount State to run this seminar. Let me say two things about this anniversary. This anniversary will commemorate what I consider to be one of the most horrific events to ever take place in modern South Carolina. And I think it ushered in this period of self-examination that we're going through today. But I want to say a second thing about this, and that is, I think that what we need to keep in mind, and I think gets lost all too often when we discuss these issues, and this is this. White people came to this country of their own free will, seeking justice, and they were running away from tyranny. As they entered the harbor, the New York harbor, they stood on the side of their boats, waiting anxiously to come ashore. Black folks came to this country against their will, chained, shackled in the belly of boats, and came ashore enslaved. And all of the institutions that have developed in this country over that more than 400-year period, starting in 1619, when the first Black came ashore, everything that has been institutionalized in this country has been designed to keep that element in place. Black folks enslaved and all that came out of it, and white folks free and the master of their own destiny. Now that frames everything that's happened in this country. And we have seen over time, when people look at the Emancipation Proclamation, it's kind of interesting that that proclamation became effective January 1, 1863. But in about 4 days, 5, we will celebrate Juneteenth. Juneteenth is the last day of slavery in this country, but it's kind of interesting. Juneteenth came about in 1865. Now that simply says slavery was outlawed by executive order of Abraham Lincoln in January 1, 1863, but it was 2.5 years later before blacks in Galveston, Texas got the word. That tells us a little bit about the importance of communication. And that's why it's so important that as we reach this, what I like to call an inflection point, that we examine our modes of communication and whether or not we are in fact communicating. I won't get into the technical definitions of what it means, but the problem is, one of the reasons we have not been able to solve this problem is because we are not communicating. We just aren't communicating. And so I think that is what is very, very critical. Now, I'm going to participate tomorrow and Wednesday in various events commemorating the 5th anniversary of the Emanuel 9. But in order to understand exactly what's going on with Black Lives Matter, I want you all to please, especially those who are participating here, take a look at the new documentary that has been aired on television. I think you can get it at stars.something, STARTZ, I believe. It's about a 75-minute documentary. I watched it a second or third time on yesterday. There was something very interesting. I will close with this. I watched the arrest of Dylann Roof. Dylann Roof, a 21-year-old self-proclaimed white supremacist, purchased a gun, which he was not legally able to have, but because of a loophole in the law, he got a gun and went to Charleston, South Carolina, and invited himself into the Bible study in the basement of Charleston's most historic church and killed 9 people. He escaped to North Carolina. About 48 hours later, he was arrested in North Carolina. And there were 3 or 4 police officers approaching his automobile with their pistols drawn. But when the lead officer got to Dylann Roof's car and walked to his door, he put his gun back in the holster and opened the door, took Dylann Roof out under arrest, gave him a drink of water, and took him to a Burger King. That was the way Dylann Roof, a 21-year-old white guy who had just killed 9 black people, that was the way he was arrested. Compare that to the arrest that we just saw in Atlanta. Had too much to drink, asked to be allowed to walk to his sister's house a few blocks away, and end up dead 20 minutes later, shot in the back. That's what we're dealing with. I'll be back.
Well, thank you, Congressman. It's an incredible, sobering moment indeed. Congresswoman Lee, you're on, and thank you for being with us today. if I can ask you to just reflect for a moment on this moment in time, this moment in our history, speak a little bit about the legislation that the House put forth a few days ago, and how we, if you can give us marching orders, if you will, about how we can help you do the work that you're doing.
Sure, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can
Absolutely.
you see me? Okay,
Yes.
Okay, I had to put this on my phone. But listen, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today. And I want to thank Steve. Steve, we miss you, but you're doing some great things. So thank you so much. I think it's important to have this discussion. And I want to thank Mr. Clyburn, our whip, especially for really setting the tone for the discussion and for his very clear understanding of history, American history, and of course, African American history is so much a part of American history. And so, Jim, thank you for really setting the stage for this. And I'll just start because Mr. Clyburn kind of laid out the entire historical context for what we're seeing today and how it's manifested in systemic racism, and why I'm introducing legislation called the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation legislation. This country has never, ever addressed the institution of slavery and enslaved people ever historically in a public way. 40 countries have held commissions, and they've been mostly called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We call ours transformation because we don't believe there's anything in this country to reconcile as it relates to African American people. And so we introduced this legislation to set up a commission that would really look at and tell the story about what has taken place 401 years ago, and how that impacts what we're seeing today in police murders, in disproportionate rates of African Americans dying from COVID-19, in the wage disparities, in the wealth gap, in the housing discrimination, in all of the areas of American life that African Americans know so well. The commission, people in this country, many don't even know and don't even understand how those chains still haven't been broken. We've come through Jim Crow, we've come through lynchings, the Black Codes, segregation, mass incarceration, and I would urge everyone to visit, and I know Congresswoman Sewell's going to talk later, the museum which Brian Stevenson has put together in Alabama. Unbelievable, from the Middle Passage to today, mass incarceration. And you see those chains, and all of those chains have not been broken. And so my commission would be an attempt to break those chains again, and to look at the truth about what happened. Then you move towards some form of discussion about healing and coming together. And then you use that as the basis for transformation, because we have to have a deconstruction of most of the systems in this country that have killed and oppressed and kept Black people enslaved in many ways throughout the centuries. And so we want this to be a commission that's going to actually give some policy recommendations to how to finally address systemic racism at its core. Secondly, I want to just mention the whole issue around Black Lives Matter. And yes, I've been in Northern California. My district, of course, is Oakland and Berkeley, California. And we were the Alicia Garza and Black Lives Matter movement, many of the leadership right here in my community. And so we've gotten it for a long time. But I was in another member's district over the weekend, in a very conservative district, and I too saw signs saying Black Lives Matter. I actually had to take pictures of them to send them to my colleague because it was remarkable. But one thing that is so important, some people say to me, and I'm sure to my other colleagues, they say, aren't you tired of trying to explain racism to white people? And I say, yeah, I'm tired, but we got to do it. We got to do it. A couple of examples. Many of my colleagues and constituents actually said, why don't you say all lives matter? You know, why is it Black Lives Matter? It's all lives matter. I say, yeah, but Black lives have never mattered. So we have to say Black Lives Matter. Then they get it. So what Mr. Clyburn said about communication is so important, because so often progressive righteous people don't even understand what's taking place and why all lives matter is offensive. Because when we say Black Lives Matter, it's because Black lives have never mattered. And so now they do matter. And so I'm saying that to say that I'm really encouraged by what is taking place throughout the country with our young people and how they're really hitting the streets, because we need that street heat. Our jobs and justice and policing bill, I think is a really powerful, excellent first step. I hope we can get it through. I know negotiations are taking place, but the Congressional Black Caucus, under the leadership of Karen Bass, they've worked day and night. We've put many provisions in to actually ban the whole notion of immunity for police officers. No one is above the law. The bill includes provisions for complete transparency and accountability. It bans, of course, chokeholds, requires more training, but we see that many police departments get this type of training and still the culture is the same. And so we've got to demilitarize the police and the bill bans the transfer of the military weapons of war to police departments under the 1033 program. And the provisions of this bill have been placed in, they're new provisions, but many of them were written in the late 90s when Congressman Conyers was in office, trying to get just reasonable police reform done. So this is the moment. It's a defining moment, I think, for our country. And we have to know that it's going to take the political support. And so I'm asking everyone to get in touch with their members of Congress and to urge them to co-sponsor the Justice in Policing Act. Ask them to co-sponsor my bill, the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Act, because co-sponsorship in DC is the name of the game. As Steve knows and my colleagues know, we need to get to 218 so we can get these bills. And I know the Justice and Policing bill is moving forward, but we still need to have more co-sponsors. Finally, let me just share a personal story. I'm from El Paso, Texas. My family, my mother and her two sisters, and myself and my two sisters were born in El Paso. But my grandfather was born in Galveston, Texas. And he was born in Galveston, Texas in May of 1865. And as Mr. Clyburn said, us in Texas didn't know that the Emancipation Proclamation had been achieved for us. And so my papa, we called him Papa, was born into during the slave period in Texas. And Juneteenth for us always as a child was a very, very special day, because that in many respects was our Independence Day. And so my grandfather told us these stories as a child, and I have tried over the years in California to educate people in my district about the importance of Juneteenth, and actually have had major events at my house around Juneteenth with many of my political supporters for a lot of reasons, but primarily to educate them about the fact that African Americans pride themselves on celebrating Juneteenth. So we do that every year. And I've done that for like the last 17 or 18 years. And so this is just another way we have got to use every way to communicate to people what the historical context is for the brutal treatment of what we see taking place now in terms of police murders and in terms of discrimination and in terms of systemic racism, which permeates this entire country. So thank you again.
No, Congressman, on that very point, I don't want to let you go until I actually get your response to this, because the president was supposed to make a speech there on Juneteenth, if I remember correctly, and he's since postponed it. But still, there's a sense that or some statement that he may make a speech on race. What was the reaction of your family and your community to that when that was announced?
Yeah, well, he was going to Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, he was going to Tulsa. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but the reaction was the same. No, the reaction was the same. How dare he? And this is more than tone deafness. This is ignorance, and this is the manifestation of white supremacy, and this is a way in-your-face kind of move that he made. Thank goodness it was pushed back. And I think that the moment, the current moment we find ourselves in with people of all backgrounds in the streets raising their voices allowed for him to, I won't see the light, but just to be embarrassed to the point where they change their tune. But not, you know, this man is off the scale when it comes to racism, white supremacy, and white nationalism.
So thank you, Congressmember. I want to turn to Congressman Cleaver, and sir, I want to ask you a question as a member of the clergy. You are a United Methodist pastor, is that right? Did I have that right? Congressman?
Is it Alex?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
For 40 years.
Yeah, and I wanted to sort of ask you about your life and your experience as a clergy member. At times like this, I often have to bring out Black Theology of Liberation, but James Cone, and sort of reflect on the importance of his words there. And I think about the support that clergy members give to their congregation and their constituents, particularly around issues of mental health and family, especially at times like these when we could be experiencing so much pain and so much hurt. I know for me, just watching these images on TV over and over again was upsetting and depressing, and cried many times. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, if you could talk a little bit about what's the role of the clergy at times like these, and as a member of Congress, how can members of Congress support community institutions like the church to be able to continue the work they do in times like this?
Okay, let me first of all, as my colleague Barbara Lee knows, I too was born in Texas and raised in Texas, and all of my family is in Texas. I think there are 112 Cleavers in Dallas County. Wow. Right now. Although we came from East in Texas, if you say I'm from East Texas, everybody would know where you're talking about. But General Granger landed in Galveston, as Jim Clyburn mentioned, on June 19th, and 1865, Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. In Texas, and I was surprised that it wasn't the case in Missouri when I moved here right out of college. But in Texas, you can't graduate from high school unless you take Texas history. I mean, it's an arrogant state in the first place, but they require it. There is nothing, not one line in Texas, of all places, in Texas history that talks about General Granger and his landing in Galveston. And yet, I grew up on Juneteenth knowing that was a state holiday for all kids who went to the colored schools. Now, all the white schools, they had school there. And there's a park outside of Waco, Texas. Right now, on Juneteenth, I mean, people would come in from as far away as El Paso, coming from Lee's hometown, which is Texas is a big place. So that's, you know, you can drive all day in Texas and not make it to El Paso, particularly if you start in East Texas. But, you know, there is absolutely nothing that compares with it when all these people come together in Waco. And so red pop in Texas, red soda, is called 19th of June. And so when I moved up here and I went to Gates Barbecue and I went in and I said I wanted 19th of June. And people, I thought they were gonna call the police on me because, you know, this man is going crazy. So it has been a big day all of my life. Now it's no longer a holiday in Texas. Was when my three sisters and I were in school, and when Barbara was in school, when Congresswoman Lee was in school. But look, religion is perhaps the most powerful human embracement. Its power is almost unlimitable. I mean, it can cause people to kill, or it can inspire people to love. It can inspire people to hate. It has been used for all reasons, for all purposes throughout the course of history. I mean, there have never been any deaths equal to the deaths caused by Christians trying to spread their Christianity. And if you don't accept my Christianity, I'm going to kill you. And so that's one of the legacies of Christianity in particular. But I think all faiths have been perverted from time to time. At a time like this, James Cone lectured at my seminary when I was in seminary. I mean, to us, he was like God was here, and James Cone was just a little bit under God. And he had written 2 or 3 books on liberation. And back then they taught it. They don't teach it in seminaries anymore, but it was taught. And what James Cone did was to present Jesus as a liberator. And that was consistent with the Hebrew text, that God was a liberator. And so many people would grow up and see Jesus as some kind of lollipop, syrupy, honey dripping guy. Just, let's just sing and hold hands and come to the potluck dinner on Wednesday. I mean, that's how Christ was born. And I come from a family of preachers, and most of them had this sacerdotal view of Jesus and the church. So they didn't get into liberation, and so I ended up kind of deviating because of my family. 2 cousins who became Black Panthers, even though they came up in the church. Pete O'Neill, who was still the only exiled Panther in the world. Barbara Lee knows him and his wife. The Wall Street Journal says, of all papers, said that he ought to be able to come back. He really doesn't want to come back to the United States, but he grew up in the Episcopalian church, and then Eldridge, who grew up in the Baptist church, and they, whom Barbara Lee knows too. You're going to get, after a while, everybody's going to come to conclusion maybe Barbara Lee was a Panther, because she knows all of them. When I visit my cousin over in Africa, the first person he asks about is Barbara Lee. They left the church, both of them, because they didn't see it offering anything. However, I think that was just one part of the African American clergy. There's always been a part of the clergy that embraced and helped create the music that laid it out clear about how we are always in a fight for our liberty and our justice. We're in the pursuit of justice. And many of the slave songs, of course, were songs about rebellion. The slave owners sitting on the porch drinking tea and saying his slaves are happy because they're singing, swing low, sweet chariot, coming to take you home, not understanding that that's the real Underground Railroad on the way, getting ready to carry you out of the South. So the church has always been a force like that. So I came in under the leadership of Philip Lawson, who preceded me at the St. James Church. Philip Lawson is the baby brother of James Lawson. James Lawson is the man who invited Martin Luther King to Memphis. He pastored the Holman Street Baptist Church there. And James Lawson is also the man who is a United Methodist pastor who taught Martin Luther King nonviolence. Jim Lawson went to prison rather than go to the Korean War. And so those guys had the influence over me, both of whom are still alive. Phil Lawson is in Congresswoman Lee's district. Jim Lawson is down in Los Angeles. And so they presented a whole new picture of the gospel to me and connected it with the Hebrew gospel, with the Hebrew text, because there was always a push and a pull for freedom in there. And so what I did when I went into the church after seminary was to see Jesus as a liberator. But it doesn't. Being a liberator doesn't mean that you're not also a comforter, because you know, in my religious tradition and Christianity, Jesus did both, and so you have to provide comfort, but you also have to make that move toward liberation. So you have to be on both. You have to do both.
So if I can, I'm sorry, Congressman, if I can just ask a question based on that, then one of the things that I think has come up several times is the role of some of the white Christian community, particularly some of those that support the president. Where are they in this dialogue about police reform and justice, and how do we, I mean, how do you convince them of what you're saying to me in terms of the role of the clergy?
I don't think you can convince them. I was on Meet the Press. I know we'll forget it. I wish I could. With Billy Graham's daughter 3 years ago. We taped the program on a Saturday because Sunday was falling on Easter was falling on a Sunday, and they wanted to do it have it showed presented on Easter Sunday, and so we were talking about. I was talking about respecting all religious traditions. And so I said, you know, sometimes Christianity is, you know, kind of a egocentric kind of a religion, especially when we talk about evangelism. And so I said, but we should respect all groups. And I said, for example, if I'm going to quote the New Testament scriptures, of the Christian Testament, I would say, in my religious tradition, we believe that Jesus was right when he said, no one cometh unto the Father except through me. And I said, but you don't say, you have to preface that by saying that's it in my religious tradition, because we live in a diverse world. And she said, no, you got to say that because that's true. And I'm on national TV. I don't hit women. I don't scream at women. But I can be insulted by women. And David Gregory was the MC at the time, ran Meet the Press, who was Jewish. And I mean, he was boiling down at the other end of the table. I think the evangelicals have operated, at least in my lifetime, that what they say is what God says. And they have perverted the gospel. There is nothing in the world that they can show me out of the Hebrew text or the Christian text that would justify supporting a man who is racist, and whose actions are certainly not in harmony with any of the scriptures. And so I have come to the conclusion of this, and as I'm concluding this, the answer to your question is that they have injected right-wing politics into the scriptures, and so they could forgive anything. That's why Reverend Graham, Billy Graham's son, said, we'll give Trump a mulligan. You know, whenever he does something wrong, well, we'll give him a mulligan. And I've read all 66 books. I have not found the word mulligan in either the Hebrew text or the Christian.
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate that, man. Congresswoman Sewell, I wanted to ask you about you made a statement the other day, and I wanted to mention it and then ask you a question about it. You made a statement that said that racism that causes our pain can be seen plainly in police brutality and in the staggering health disparities of our communities have endured throughout this pandemic. It can be seen in thinly veiled attempts to put African Americans in our place, holding on to and idolizing a time when our bodies were not our own. And it can be seen in the state-sanctioned holidays and monuments that honor the leaders of the Confederacy, including Jefferson Davis Day. So I wanted to talk to you as a member from Alabama and your connection to Selma. If you can talk about the calling for an ending to the holiday in particular, but also this sort of running debate between Senator Jones and former Trump Attorney General Jeff Sessions about getting rid of the vestiges of the Confederacy and what that means for your state and for the country.
Thank you so much for that question. And I want to thank Steve Israel, our former colleague, for inviting me on this program. And it's always a pleasure to be the runner-up to Whip Clyburn and to the revolutionary Barbara Lee, who speaks for me and everybody else, as well as our wonderful pastor, keeps all of us in line, Emanuel Cleaver. It's an honor to be on this program. In the wake of the George Floyd's murder and the subsequent protests that we've seen all across this nation, there's just no denying that this is a moment in time that in my lifetime that I've never witnessed before. And I think that it is required, as Jim Clyburn said, self-examination, as Barbara Lee said, we want to make sure that the street heat is on so that we actually know that this is what democracy looks like, that we live in a democracy that is imperfect, but that it is a form of government that allows citizens to seek redress from its government. And I just pray that this moment will yield the kind of direct action that is so needed and what that outcry is about. I don't have to remind this group of panelists that power concedes nothing without a demand, never has, never will. It was true in 1850 when Frederick Douglass said it, and it's true today. I think that this moment calls upon all of us to do all that's in our power, wherever we are, in whatever platform we have, to see, to hear, and to act. Our role as federal officials is to have a federal response. And we know that policing is first and foremost a local and state, that they have the most influence on crime and on policing. But I think that I'm very proud of what the Congressional Black Caucus has put together in the Justice and Policing Act as a response to this. But there's also no denying that it's requiring all of us to do the easy stuff, because the hard stuff is really hard. And states like Alabama, South Carolina, Texas, the states of the Confederacy, we've long been calling upon them to get rid of these vestiges of white supremacy. And that's really, the state holiday that we celebrate in Alabama for Jefferson Davis, and we even have the nerve to celebrate Martin Luther King's Day in conjunction with the celebration of Robert E. Lee's birthday.
Wow.
It's unacceptable. And frankly, it's a low-hanging fruit. If we're saying in this time, in this space that Black Lives Matter, then see me and hear me and remove those vestiges of white supremacy. I think that, I'm a daughter of Selma. I not only have the great honor of representing Selma, Birmingham, Montgomery, the Alabama Civil Rights District in Congress, but I'm a daughter of Selma, and I'm a longtime member of Brown Chapel AME Church, where Martin Luther King led the march from Selma to Montgomery. And if I've learned anything as a daughter of Selma about its history, its living and breathing history, is that, racial violence and peaceful protests have gone hand in hand in bringing about positive change in this nation. It's unfortunate that you need both. The reality is that while John Lewis and the peaceful protesters were peaceful, the violence that was hoisted upon them, that it took the death of the 4 little girls to get us to the Civil Rights Act of 1965. It took John Lewis and Amelia Boynton and Hosea Williams and so many others bludgeoned on a bridge in my hometown of Selma to get us a Voting Rights Act. It took the riots of '68 to get us a Fair Housing Act. And it's gonna take this protest, and we're now into what, day 20? Of protests around this nation. It is a moment that is worth acknowledging. And I think that it is a different moment. And I think that, you know, while our primary purpose as members of Congress should be on extending the rights of the living and not on the transgressions of the dead, I think the voices on the streets are crying out, not so much that we remove these Confederate memorials, but that we actually have positive change. So I think we have to take off the table the easy stuff. And it should be easy for states like Alabama and states like South Carolina to get rid of these memorials. After all, the Confederate memorials were brought about as the history lesson that Whip Clyburn often tells us, you know, is after Reconstruction, so many of these Confederate states decided to memorialize these Confederate generals and these Confederate as a way of memorializing and honoring Southern white supremacy. And, you know, I have not formally come out and said this, but I really think that it's time that we revisit all of these Confederate memorials, and that includes the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I've long said that the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the bridge in Selma, while it has the events that brought about the Voting Rights Act, has transcended that bridge from the name that it's associated and named after. It's transcended it into the movement that everybody remembers it to be. But all things should be on the table at this point, even the renaming of the bridge. We need to make sure that that we remove any of the barriers that will get us to really effective and transformational change. And so if the will of the people is to remove even the name of that's on the bridge, I'm down with that. I think time's up with the easy stuff. We have some weight. The hard stuff is trying to decide whether or not we, you know, get rid of qualified immunity, change the standard of excessive force. That's going to be the hard stuff. So when my white colleagues tell me what they can do, I say, there's a lot you can do. Be willing to do the easy stuff.
Right. And thank you very much, Congresswoman. I wanted to circle back to Congresswoman Lee, because we're not only talking about the monuments and such that are up in Alabama, we're also talking about what's in the halls of our U.S. Capitol as well. And I wanted to make sure that I got in here that you and Congressman Benny Thompson, Congressmember Lee, introduced a bill to remove Confederate statues from the U.S. Capitol. So I want to make sure that I got that in. And then I wanted to also ask you a question about a little bit of your past and a little bit of a look forward. I understand you invited Shirley Chisholm to speak at college when you were in college and you went to work on her campaign. So I wanted to sort of ask you to reflect on sort of that moment and getting involved then. And you're a DNC member now, if I understand that correctly, and to think about sort of where we are today with, you know, so many young people, particularly some of the Black Lives Matter movement, may not feel that the party is for them. So I wanted to ask you to sort of talk a little bit about sort of your experience back in working with Shirley Chisholm and how the fervor that's out there among young people and the role and the place that they may have or should have or could have in the party today in terms of being able to affect change from both within and without.
Well, let me tell you, thank you so much. And I want to just say, since Reverend Cleaver busted me, and he's my friend, glad you give me a chance to talk just a little bit about that, because Reverend Cleaver knows that I come from a faith background, and all of my work has been put within the context of Jesus being a revolutionary. And his life is a life that I think that many of us who are Christians, for example, and other faiths try to exemplify and try to do that work here on this world, on this earth. And so way back in the day, and again, this comes from my faith tradition, I was a student at Mills College, and I was president of Black Student Union. I believed, like many young people believe now, that I was not going to register to vote because I didn't believe the two-party system was relevant to myself. I was a young single mother on public assistance, formerly a victim of domestic violence, you know, the whole 9 yards. And I wanted to, you know, make a better life for my children, for myself. But at the same time, I wanted to do this for my community. So I was president of Black Student Union, and yes, I was working not as a member of the Black Panther Party, but as a community worker with the Black Panther Party, bagging groceries. I was feeding kids. You know, the Black Panther Party started the first free breakfast program for children. Going to the clinic, they started the first community clinic. So the 10-point program is something that gets lost. And also the Black Panther Party was standing down the police, because the police murders and brutality then, as we see now, was an important issue, and we had to do something to stop the police brutality. And so, you know, it was a very important moment for the civil rights movement, which that was in our community in the Bay Area, and also an important moment to feed hungry children. And so as the president of Black Student Union, I decided I was going to continue to work with the Black Panther Party, continue to study, but no way was I going to be part of the political system. So I invited Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm as the first African-American woman to speak at Mills College. Now, I had a little budget with the BSU, so we were able to get her out there. And I had a class in government at the same time, and part of my requirement was to work in one of the campaigns. Then it was McGovern, Muskie, Humphrey. Well, I said, flunk me. I have never flunked a class in my life, but I told my professor I was not going to work in these white guys' campaigns because they weren't speaking to the issues that I cared about and to the Black community. So I was going to flunk the class. So I invited Shirley Chisholm. Shirley came and spoke, and she said she was running for president. I could not believe it. Shirley Chisholm spoke fluent Spanish. She talked about immigrant rights. She talked about ending poverty. She was an educator. She was a guest of the Vietnam War. I mean, she was a feminist. She was trying to put together coalitions of white women and women of color and Black women. She was like, wow, I cannot believe this. So when I went up to her after the speech, I said, you know, I have this class I'm going to flunk, but after hearing you, I mean, I had no idea you were running for president. She took me to task, and she said, look, little girl, and I was in my 20s and big afro, two little kids, and jeans, t-shirt, you know, power to the people. And so she convinced me then to register to vote. So I went back and talked to my professor. I said, yeah, okay, how do I pass this class? What do I do? And I asked Shirley what to do. She said, I'm leaving it up to my local supporters. I don't have a lot of national money, so I don't know. You figure it out. So there was no campaign in the Bay Area. So I went and talked to my professor, and she told me the same thing. That's part of the coursework. You got to figure that out. So I registered to vote, talked to a couple of my colleagues in class and at one of the community colleges. Bottom line is I ended up organizing the Shirley Chisholm presidential primary from my class at Mills College. I got an A in the class. I registered to vote. I went on to Miami, Florida as a Shirley Chisholm delegate where I met Mr. Clyburn, and the rest is history. And so and since then I've tried to preserve Shirley's legacy. We did a stamp in honor of Congresswoman Chisholm. We finally got her painting in the halls of the Capitol, finally. So we've been doing a lot to preserve her legacy. But as I look back, I said, yeah, I understand what these young people are saying. I understand exactly what they're talking about in terms of the police departments and needing to really reimagine what policing is like. I understand what it means if you're reluctant to participate, but I also know what Shirley told me. And she told me, look, if you're gonna want to make some systemic change, and if you really want to make a difference, you've got to get on the inside, and you've got to work with us in the party to make the Democratic Party more inclusive, to make it a grassroots organization, to make it more equitable as it relates to people of color. And you've got to help us from the inside. And when you get on the inside, she said, don't play by the rules because they weren't made for you. She said, you got to get in there and you got to change the rules of the game. And so that's what I've been doing. And yeah, I've been a member of the DNC now for, I guess, 8 years, and I'm still working with the party to try to make it more equitable, more inclusive, and more in the vision of what Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm had envisioned during her presidential campaign. And that was 1972.
Oh, wow. I shouldn't say, but that was the year I was born, but I'm not trying to.
Gee, thanks. You heard
I'm just saying. It just shows how long your commitment to public service is. That's what I'm saying.
So this is a lifetime struggle. I mean, this is a marathon. I work for Rondell, and this is a lap of the race we all have to run.
Absolutely. I know we want to get to some audience or participant questions. I just want to do a very quick lightning round with everybody. I want to start with Congressmember Cleaver. You were a mayor of Kansas City, the first African-American mayor of Kansas City, if I got that right. And I think you were there during the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict. What I wanted to know is, as we look at the mayors like those in San Francisco, Atlanta, DC, and Chicago, who've been so much at the forefront these days, all Black women, I might add, I would love for you to speak to the relationship between mayors and police departments, what that's like when you're dealing with union contracts, and the role of police culture in trying to reform departments, and we'll talk a little bit about what these mayors and governors might be up against.
Well, it's always going to be difficult, particularly if you're the first mayor of color to a city like Kansas City. It's always going to be tough, and you have to try to balance, that relationship without in any way embracing bad conduct on the part of the police. When Rodney King, the court decision was rendered, the United States lit up. And I was in my office in City Hall. It was late in the evening, and one of the council members, Carol Coe, called me up in the office and said, Mayor, you need to get out here and you need to come very quickly. So I had a security detail. They put me in a car, and then all the way out there, they were telling me, we're required to do what you tell us, but we don't think you ought to go out here. So I got police telling me, don't go. I have, they're telling me about almost 1,000 people have gathered, getting ready to march into the Country Club Plaza, which is like a ritzy shopping center. In fact, it was the first shopping center away from downtown in the country. And so I called the police chief from the car and said, please don't send any police out here, and no helicopters and that kind of thing. So we went out, and the ministers, the good news was the ministers who were there stood up on a podium with me, and they said, look, we're not going to do this because this is going to hurt the mayor, and it's going to also hurt all of us. Let's not, because it was going to be bad when they crossed into that area. So I think that the key for any mayor is to have a good police chief, because it starts from the top. And I had a police chief, Steve Bishop, who had been on the department for 20-something years and had never, ever pulled his gun out of his holster, not one time. And, oh, more, I mean, you can't ask for anything better. And he was also on the Mafia Task Force. Kansas City has historically been like the #2 city with the mob, and they were in charge of the casinos in Las Vegas historically. And so the good thing about dealing with this issue for me was I had a good police chief, and I could say to anybody, look, we don't need to do this. The chief of police has never even pulled his gun, and then you got to be out there yourself, talking to people, trying to convince people that that anything that happens out there in the streets after dark is bad. And I used to tell people all the time, Martin Luther King never led a march at night. The whole point of demonstrations is to demonstrate in full view of the public. And so at night, there's a different group that used to come out, and they still do at night, the nighttime protesters. And when I addressed the protesters here a couple of weeks ago, that's what I said. We want to be daytime protesters. Nobody, why would you march across Edmund Pettus Bridge at night? Or Greene County, Alabama, where they had Dobermans out on us. So I think that police chief, you have to have a good one. And number two, I think you've got to be able, whoever the mayor is, has got to be able to walk that thin line, making sure that he or she is with the people while at the same time trying to deal with the police.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry, and since you talk about the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I want to turn to Congresswoman Sewell for a moment. I have two quick questions. One actually submitted from one of our viewers, or one of our audience members, if you will. Mildred Sanders is asking about the importance of nonviolent protests and the way, and if you could reflect a bit on the way that some, particularly the president, has commented on the protests and some of the violence that has occurred. If you could talk a little bit about that, and also given what happened with elections in Georgia a week ago, if you have any thoughts on the unprecedented obstacles that are in place for particularly African Americans that want to exercise their right to vote. If you could talk about voter suppression and some of the tactics being used in the region and how we might be able to overcome that.
Great. So yeah, I think that in this moment, we can't let the looting and violence of a few outweigh the multitude of voices of peaceful, although angry and screaming into the top of their lungs, protests of the many. The righteous indignation that people are feeling, I think, and the fact that it is a beautiful mosaic of Black and white and people of all colors is a real testament to this moment being different and seizing this as an opportunity for real systemic change. The root cause is institutional or structural or systemic racism. And this moment, we're focused on Black Lives Mattering. And I think that one of the things I would love to see as a part of this movement, we have to first address and focus on the police accountability and transparency, which the Justice in Policing Act does. But we in the House of Representatives passed the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would fully restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We did so in December, HR 4. I was honored to carry that bill. And what that bill sought to do was to address the nullification of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act that the Shelby versus Holder decision did, put squarely on the shoulders of Congress to come up with a modern day formula by which we would decide what jurisdictions have had a history of voter discrimination such that they would be required to pre-clear with the Justice Department. So right. Section 5 is still there. It's just that Section 4, there is no requirement as to how we determine which jurisdictions have to be pre-cleared. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's converging all at once. We have this pandemic, which has really is not being acknowledged by states like Alabama. We still have on the books that in order to vote, you have to have a photo ID. And even though it's safer to vote from home, we don't have no excuse absentee voting. So you have to have an excuse. You can check the box for sickness, but you still have to be able to have a photocopy of your photo ID that you have to turn in order to get that ballot. What we saw in Georgia, I'm mighty afraid, could be symptomatic of what we will see in states all across America if we don't do something about that. It is clear to me that this will be the first time in my lifetime that we have a census. We're doing the census right now, and we're in the middle of this pandemic. We have a census. When I think about all the levers of civic engagement, voting, the census, peaceful protests, all of them are converging in the midst of a pandemic. And this will be the first time that we will have redistricting in my lifetime without the full weight of the Voting Rights Act, which means that the Alabama will be drawing its lines, and those lines will be determined by state legislatures, Republican held all across the nation, that we would have to then only be able to use Section 2 to then, after the election, after the lines have been drawn, challenge those lines in court. You can't unring the bell or move away, get folks who are already elected out of office that way. So I think first and foremost, we've got to get the Senate to pass H.R. 4. It's been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. I know that Congressman Clyburn issued a Vote Safer Act, which would give more money to the states at this point to try to do more vote by mail. And those bills like that are critically important because while we may no longer have to count how many jelly beans are in a jar or recite how many counties in the state of Alabama in order to vote, there are, make no mistake about it, modern day barriers to voting. And we in Congress have to do our very best to tear down those barriers. And until we do, we have to be vigilant in educating everyone about what the requirements are to do absentee ballots, to make sure we have enough polling stations, enough polling workers, and that we do everything we can to make sure that we overcome the voter suppression tactics that are sure to come in this November election.
Right, no, thank you. And I wanted to use that as a moment to pivot to Congressmember Clyburn. I have two very quick questions before we go to take a few from our assembled guests. The first is just on some of the concerns around the defund police conversation that's taking place right now. I know that you said that you weren't supportive of defund police per se, but you did talk about ways that we could go, that we could engage in comprehensive reform. So I just wanted you to talk very briefly about sort of your position on that and what you thought.
I think Jim is, Mr. Whip, just need to turn your audio on. Here you go.
There you go. Nope.
Okay.
There you go.
There we go.
Are we there?
All right.
Okay, thank you. Let me, one of the things that bother me so much about the whole defund the police issue, it's not what is intended. I've talked to people about that, but I've been in politics long enough to know that if you spend a whole lot of time trying to explain what you mean, you will lose the argument.
Yeah.
Just that simple. Secondly, I think that I've seen John Lewis and I met in 1960, August of 1960, 12 years before I met Barbara Lee, when I cast my vote for Shirley Chisholm to be president. There were 2 votes from South Carolina for Shirley Chisholm in 1972 down in Miami. Dr. Beck from Florence and Maine. But 12 years earlier, I met John, and we had a great movement. A movement that went about integrating lunch counters. We were registering people to vote, running people for office. You see that South Carolina State was the first co-ed college in this African-American co-ed college in this country that elected a woman to be a student body president. We did that in 1960. So we were having tremendous success. And all of a sudden we woke up one morning and the headline was, "Burn, baby, burn." We lost the movement. And that's my problem. I don't want us to lose this movement. Let's build on it. We got to restructure policing. We got to reimagine what it's all about. And someone said earlier, I think you said, Basil, I was pleased you said that. There are a couple of things you mentioned. I want to mention, says, we ought not be, mental health issues are not police issues. But today, somebody's mentally ill, they end up in in jail.
Yeah.
Because you call the police. School discipline. I'm still remembering a little girl, 12 years old, Spring Valley High School here in Columbia, being handcuffed by the police. Call the police on a 12-year-old child. You know, these kinds of issues are what we're talking about. You don't want to defund the police. Get the police to doing what police is supposed to do, and let's restructure policing. So that's why I got a real problem with that, because these headlines, or these, what we call them, sound bites, will give you a good headline, but will they make any headway? That's my problem. We are all about making headway, but there are some people, as Cleaver just said, are more interested in a headline the next morning and to do anything with a Molotov cocktail, anything else the night before in order to make a headline the next morning.
So I want to follow up, and just as you talk about headway, we have a presidential race this year, obviously. You've endorsed Joe Biden. I want to actually talk about that as a way to sort of close our part of the conversation, get to the audience questions. I won't ask who he's choosing as his number 2. I won't go there. We'll have a conversation offline, and we'll get to that perhaps. But you know, I listened intently to your endorsement that day, and it sounded as though you were not just talking about your history as an activist and your history as a member of Congress working with Joe Biden, but you also seem to be sending a message to young people to say that this movement continues, that there is a continuity here, and that you were trying to create that bridge, and that you believe that Joe Biden was the best person to be in the White House that we could work with to be able to continue the work that we need to do. I saw that not just as a statement about your history, but about trying to connect the work that you've done and that so many others on this call have done to young people today. So in closing, I would just love to hear your thoughts on, you know, how does Joe Biden bring in young people? And I ask that in part because there's a New York Times article, I think it was over the weekend, that said that the Black power or Black politics is over. I think there's a Washington Post article that talked about how young people were very skeptical of the party. And considering everything that's been said and done, and this presidential race and what's at stake, I just wanted you to close this out a little bit, at least the formal part of this conversation, with a look ahead at the race in 2020 and the Joe Biden presidency.
Well, you've put a lot in there to try to unpack.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I know.
Let me say a couple of things about that. Number one, what I've said to young people, that endorsement, by the way, Bernice Johnson was standing with me there that day in North Charleston when I made the endorsement. And a lot of people asked what got into me. And about an hour before, NAN, National Action Network, it named a new award in honor of my wife. Now, I knew about the award. I was invited to this breakfast, I thought to make a statement or something. But what they had done, they had named this new award in my late wife's honor, and I was going to be the first recipient. And when I was there receiving the award, Joe Biden walked in to be a part of the presentation. All of this took place within an hour before the endorsement. And so when I went to the mic, the emotions of that were all there. And so that's what was the background to that. And Ada Bernice and I, on the way to the endorsement, chatted about Joe Biden and the goodness of this country, the goodness of America. And so what I was really saying is that we have choices to make in this presidential election. And I would say to young people, or older people for that matter, anybody that start comparing candidates. You know, Joe Biden should not be compared to the Almighty, rather to the alternative. And that's what I think we have to keep in mind. One of two people will be inaugurated come January, God willing, one of two people. And the question is, which one of those choices will better adhere to the goodness of this country? This country doesn't have to be made great again. This is a great country. What we've got to do is figure out how to make that greatness accessible and affordable for all of its citizens. We got a great healthcare system. It's just not accessible and affordable to everybody. A great educational system. You name it, this country is great. What we need to do is have its basic goodness brought to the forefront. And I don't think the incumbent allows that. I think Joe Biden offers that. And so that's all I was trying to say. And it's interesting you would say what you said about that, because I got an editorial, there's an editorial written in the Dallas newspapers. Eddie Benice Johnson sent it to me last week. And they called that endorsement a reigniting of the civil rights movement. And I was surprised at that, I really was. But when I read that and listened to you here today, I think I better go back and do a little bit of reading to see exactly what that connection is. Hopefully that's what it is, because we need for this country's goodness. Now I'll close with this. I've been quoting Alexis de Tocqueville a lot here of late. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his 1835-36 two-volume book, Democracy in America, de Tocqueville said, America is not great because it's more enlightened than any other nation, but rather because it's always been able to repair its faults. That's what makes this country great, the ability to repair its faults. Now, we have had some faults revealed. Our healthcare system, COVID-19 has revealed that. Our policing system, these faults are there. Now, the question is, will we be able to repair those faults? And if we are willing to do that, then who among our candidates for president can best help us repair those faults?
Thank you, Congressman. That was outstanding. And for all the panelists, it ends my time. I know Steve's not going to let me moderate another conversation ever again. So I'll go to Natalie, because I know there are a couple of questions waiting, and hope that we have the time to hear a few from those that have joined us today. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Natalie.
Well, Basil, actually, let me interrupt. I promised our members of Congress a hard stop at 6:30, and I want to honor that promise. They have a million things to do. They're very busy. Basil, I don't know whether you had some folks from the chat room or whether you had a question, just one question to get in for our guests before we wrap it up. Do you have?
I think I've from what I saw, I've gotten to what came to me, so I'm good.
With apologies to those of you who did have questions, I think we were really enlightened, and I know there were many questions, but just having these members of Congress share their observations at this critical time, I think was a remarkable opportunity. So let me just make a few closing comments. First, for those of you who experience moments of despair and depression, who wonder whether we're going to survive the critical challenges of our time, no matter what side of the aisle you happen to be on, I hope that this was an inspiring evening. These members of Congress and their colleagues are in the trenches. They're on the front lines. They work every single day and night to ensure that there is equal justice under the law. They serve their constituents. They move our country forward. And so I want to thank them for the work that they have done. Many people often ask me whether I miss Congress, and my answer is always the same. You know, sometimes I miss the institution, but I always miss people like Jim Clyburn and Terri Sewell and Barbara Lee and Emanuel Cleaver and the others with whom I had the privilege of serving. Tomorrow at noon, for those of you who are interested, Inside the Presidential Election with Charlie Cook, CNN's SC Cup, who will take a conservative perspective, and Basil Smikle. We are arranging for several Republican members of the House to join us to provide their perspectives on the election upcoming. And June 25th, Adam Schiff briefing us on potential election intrusions by foreign powers. My former colleagues, thank you again. God bless you. Thank you for the extraordinary work that you're doing. Basil Smikle, thank you for being a top-notch moderator, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, Basil.